Before there were emails, telegrams, or even paper envelopes, there were horses. Tired, shaggy Mongolian horses, trotting endlessly across windblown plains with messages few would ever read, but many depended on. Tonight, we travel along forgotten roads where no one runs anymore. Roads carved not by kings or armies, but by paperwork, taxes, and bureaucracy on horseback. This is not the story of Genghis Khan's conquests, but of the quiet men who came after, the riders, the clerks, the ones who delivered news across empires without glory or recognition. So settle in. The roads are long, the weather is cold, and our rider is just leaving the stable. Chapter 1. Echoes of empire in the dust. You are sitting near a flickering lantern. The soft crackle of firewood mixes with the faint rhythm of hoofbeats, imagined ones, perhaps carried through time. In this first section, we begin not in the 18th century, but in the dust-worn echoes of an empire long thought to have fallen silent. The Mongol Empire, known for conquest, cruelty, and expansion, left behind something far less glamorous, but far more durable: a bureaucratic postal system built for survival. By the mid-1700s, Mongolia was no longer the imperial juggernaut it had once been. The great Khans had vanished. Russia pressed from one side, the Qing dynasty from the other. But one relic of Genghis Khan's administrative genius endured, quietly and efficiently: the YAM, a network of relay stations and mounted couriers that once supported the Mongol armies. While the empire had splintered, the infrastructure specifically, the courier roads stretching across hundreds of miles, remained intact, and in many cases, still in use. The YAM was a relay system that stretched across Asia and into Europe during the Mongol Empire's peak. At its height, it featured more than 1,400 relay stations, each spaced a day's ride apart. Riders could swap out their horses and press on. These couriers traveled with peza, small tablet-like passports that gave them authority and demanded hospitality. In 13th century Persia, a peza was as good as gold. In 18th century Mongolia, it still commanded respect in certain provinces. Why? Because communication mattered. Even centuries later, in remote areas governed by Qing-appointed local administrators, messages still needed to move across the vast steppes. Taxes had to be counted. Dissent had to be monitored. A governor in Uliastai needed word from the farthest banners under his rule. And there were only two ways to make that happen: by foot or by horse. The YAM, reduced though it was, still won. The argument: this created an unusual reality. Somewhere between 1750 and 1780, a traveler riding east from Lake Kovsgau might still encounter a weather-worn wooden station, tended by a local family with government obligation. They would shelter a courier overnight, feed his horse dried dung-heated oats, and in the morning send him off with a fresh mount. Most of the riders were not elite messengers. They were tired, underpaid, overworked civil servants inherited from the Qing administrative system, but functioning in the spirit of Genghis Khan. They wore sheepskin coats and woolen gloves. Some carried letters in grease-sealed pouches. Others bore verbal orders committed to memory, trusted not for speed, but for accuracy. Occasionally, an imperial inspector would come through, counting horses, checking stables, and reporting back to Beijing. But often the system ran on trust and tired wheels. A kettle boiling in the corner, a ledger filled with unreadable scribbles. This was bureaucracy in the saddle, and yet these roads moved power. They allowed governors to function. They carried reports of bandit attacks, tax discrepancies, and rumors from across the border. All atop shaggy Mongolian horses bred not for elegance, but for endurance. In the deep winter, frost froze the riders' eyebrows. In summer, dust cakes thickened their throats. Still they rode. Today, you might stand on the open steppe, look to the horizon, and see nothing but emptiness. But once, along those same windswept trails, the hoofbeats of bureaucracy thundered. Softly, How did a system built for conquest adapt into quiet civil use? And how long could such a relic last under foreign rule? Chapter 2. The relay lives on. It's 1764. Somewhere near the chilly grasslands north of the Khangai Mountains, a Mongolian courier wakes before dawn. His yurt is cold, and the wind howls like a ghost across the steppe. His breakfast, fermented maize milk and stale millet, is unremarkable. But he tightens the fur-lined belt around his sheepskin coat, checks the wax-sealed pouch tied to his saddle, and steps out into a job that few remember and fewer romanticize. Messenger for an empire that no longer exists. In this second section, we move deeper into the details, the day-to-day labor of those who kept the yam system breathing long after the Mongol Empire's fall. We'll meet the riders, the station keepers, and the reluctant farmers whose livestock kept imperial communication alive in the most unglamorous way imaginable. At this point in the 18th century, the yam had largely been absorbed into the Qing administrative structure, but the system retained its bones. The Qing dynasty, pragmatic and always attentive to frontier management, saw the usefulness of what remained. They repurposed it, rebranded it even, but the roots, the duties, the burdens fell largely on the same people who had upheld it for generations, rural Mongols. Relay stations known in earlier centuries as ortu had once been built of timber and stone. Now many were humble, half-collapsed buildings reinforced with mud brick. Some were nothing more than tents pitched beside a wooden post, bearing a carved symbol or imperial stamp. The role of the station keeper was hereditary in some regions, passed down like a tired family business no one wanted. Each station was responsible for a set quota of horses, feed, and lodging. This wasn't voluntary. The Qing court levied this as a corvée duty taxation, not in silver, but in service. Villagers near the stations had to provide dried fodder or rotate horses. In particularly lean years, this could mean sacrificing a working animal from their farm for the state. It was not a popular obligation, but the infrastructure functioned. In western Kavsgal province, a lone courier could cover 70 kilometers in a single day if the stations were well supplied. More often, he trudged slowly through the bitter cold, stopping every few hours for warmth. He carried administrative orders, appointment letters, census summaries, military observations. Nothing revolutionary, just the slow grind of empire. Maintenance. The system was deeply inefficient by modern standards. Delays were common, horses went lame, and riders fell ill. In 1769, a Qing military report from Yulia Stai lamented the incomplete returns from the banner offices due to poor provisioning at northern stations. But even this complaint was filed by a courier who relied on the very network he criticized. Station records, when preserved, were painfully mundane. A surviving log from a station in central Mongolia reads like an accounting ledger for livestock rather than people. Received courier tumor on the third day, second moon. Lodged him one night, provided 1 horse, age 6, 2 gin of barley, 1 measure of melted tallow, repaired saddle strap. Horse was returned lame, delivered on 5th day, second moon. What these records don't say is how Tumor felt that night. How his fingers ached from holding frozen reins. How he mumbled the imperial report to himself by candlelight, fearful of forgetting a phrase. How he wondered whether the man receiving the message even cared, and yet, even with all this drudgery, there was pride. Couriers viewed themselves as keepers of connection, however small the strand. Many were literate in Mongolian and Manchu scripts, trained in memorization and restraint. They were warned never to read the sealed messages, though some did. Occasionally, a rider vanished, either dead on the trail or absconding. Their names were scratched from station rosters with quiet finality. The horses were as essential as the men. Stocky, short-legged, incredibly resilient. Mongolian horses could survive on withered grasses and scraped snow for water. A good courier knew how to read his mount's fatigue. He'd rub ointment on cracked hooves, whisper soft words into the mane. When a horse died en route, it was both a loss and a liability. Official policy required a report, but many couriers buried the animal beside the trail and said nothing. Occasionally, the system encountered oddities. One Qing military log mentions an instance in which a courier's message was intercepted by wolves, not metaphorically, but literally. His bag, torn open while he slept under his horse's blanket, was found scattered with claw marks the next morning. The message miraculously was still legible, if a bit blood-stained. He delivered it late, but intact. The Yan system in the 18th century was not glorious. It was bureaucratic, aging, patched together with frayed rope and exhausted families. But it worked. When uprisings loomed or taxes fell short, when border disputes simmered or census records went missing, the couriers moved quietly, invisibly, enduringly. But what did it mean to serve a system so invisible? And how long could its riders remain loyal to a world changing around them? Chapter 3: Dust, Disappearance, and the Last Riders. It is the year 1795. The empire hums onward, not with fanfare, but with footnotes. In the far stretches of what is now Western Mongolia, the riders still travel, but their numbers are fewer. The horses are older, the leather satchels have cracked, and the message is, well, sometimes they no longer matter to anyone. In this final section, we follow the twilight years of the Yan courier system, not as a collapse, but as a gradual fade. Not with revolution, but with paperwork. By the turn of the 19th century, the courier stations that once formed the vertebrae of empire were becoming increasingly obsolete. The Qing bureaucracy, massive, layered, intricate, began adopting new internal strategies for communication, particularly along the better connected regions of China proper. In the Mongolian frontier, however, innovation came slowly and sometimes not at all, but decline, like erosion, is rarely noticed in the moment. A report dated 1793 from a Qing magistrate in Kuri, modern-day Ulaanbaatar, refers to several relay posts being inoperative due to the absence of resident families. This was the common fate. Not disbandment, not rebellion, just families leaving. Fields needed tending, and sons didn't wish to inherit the burden of feeding couriers for no pay. The empire, already distant, had nothing more to offer them. And so slowly, the doors closed. Still, the ghost of the system lingered. Some stations remained active in name only. An old man sleeping beside an empty post. A single horse tethered to a sagging beam. Couriers would knock out of habit or hope. Sometimes they found hot milk. Other times only wind and silence. There are stories, quiet, unverifiable, but persistent, of riders continuing their duties even after the routes had been officially dissolved. They rode with no orders but tradition, delivering census reports. No one would read. There's a vague reference in an 1811 border log to a gray-haired courier from the north, bearing imperial seal on his hat, though unrecognized by our ledgers. He was allowed to deliver his message anyway. No one had the heart to stop him. Why did they keep riding? It's possible that for some, the route itself had become a kind of identity. Their job wasn't glamorous, but it was purposeful. In a land where survival was often the only ambition, the regular rhythm of travel, reporting, and return gave structure to otherwise vast uncertainty. To carry a sealed message, even a meaningless one, was to serve a story bigger than your own. Even as the Qing dynasty edged toward internal crisis, economic strain, administrative bloat, and growing unrest, the outer provinces like Mongolia experienced this decline as a slow forgetting. There were no dramatic closures of the courier system. No formal farewell to the yam. Instead, there was just dust. Horses that were never replaced. Riders who stopped receiving new orders. Saddles that remained hung on walls long after the last trip. By 1820, Most of the original Yam infrastructure was either abandoned or absorbed into more centralized Qing-run logistics routes. What remained were traces. A broken post here, a traveler's folk song there, mentioning the wind chaser with the seal of the Khan, and perhaps most curiously, the Mongolian language itself, preserved echoes. The word crew, once used to refer to courier stations, would linger in place names for generations. In some towns today, you may still pass a dusty bend in the road, known locally as Old Crew 2 Hill, or the place of fast horses. No signs mark it. Just a memory in the land you may find this anticlimactic. There's no final battle, no ceremony. Only the slow end of relevance. But perhaps that is the quiet fate of all administrative miracles. They are not built to be remembered. They are built to function. Until one day, they no longer do, and somewhere on the steppe, beneath a sky too wide to hold history, a final rider once paused, poured a measure of fermented milk into a chipped mug, and waited for a message that would never arrive. Thank you for spending this quiet journey through history with me. If you're still here, whether you're drifting off or just enjoying a moment of calm, I'm really glad you joined. If you'd like more softly told, slow-paced stories about the hidden corners of our past, feel free to like this video and subscribe to Quite Boring Sleep. There are plenty more forgotten trails, dusty documents, and overlooked people waiting to be rediscovered. Very slowly and very gently sleep well. And I'll see you in the next story.